Reddit Bilinguals, what's the funniest story you've had when someone didn't realize you understood their language? This isn't my story, but one from a professor I had in an Asian studies class. He's a white guy from upstate New York who happens to be fluent in Chinese. While riding a train in Beijing, he overheard two Chinese girls chatting about one of their boyfriends. The girl was venting about how her boyfriend hadn't proposed after all this time, and it was driving her crazy. Frustrated, she essentially said, "At this point, I'll just say yes to the next guy who asks me to marry him." Having followed the entire conversation, my professor decided to have a bit of fun. He got down on one knee and, speaking flawless Chinese, proposed to her right there. Both girls were utterly stunned, their jaws practically hitting the floor. They panicked and hurriedly exited the train at the next stop. I'm white, from the South, and I'm conversational in Mandarin. Back in undergrad, I worked at our university's affiliated law school. One day, I was riding the elevator to my floor when two girls from Beijing, their regional accent gave it away. The way they add R's randomly is distinct, stepped in and started chatting about me. They were saying flattering things. He's handsome. I really like his eyes, and so on. As the elevator reached my floor, I turned to them, looked directly into their eyes, and said in Mandarin, "Thanks. You're from Beijing, right?" Their reactions were priceless. Both of their jaws practically hit the floor, and one of them gave a shy nod before catching herself and looking embarrassed. The doors closed, leaving them stunned, mouths still wide open. I walked away laughing harder than I had in ages. I must have been around 10 or 11 when this happened. Our whole family, my immediate family, plus my aunt, uncle, and cousins, went on a big trip to Disney World. On the way back, we stopped at a McDonald's for dinner. My little cousin, as usual, was being difficult and refused to eat. A couple of black guys, probably in their 30s, were sitting a few tables away. My aunt, trying to get my cousin to behave, kept telling him in Vietnamese that those men would take him away if he didn't eat. When the two guys finished their meal, they walked over to our table. To everyone's shock, they greeted my aunt with a friendly hello in near-perfect Vietnamese. My aunt was absolutely mortified. Her face turned bright red, and she looked like she was about to cry. We couldn't stop laughing because, frankly, she got what she deserved. That's hilarious. It reminds me of a story my dad once shared. When he first immigrated to the U.S. from Korea, he worked at a convenience store owned by a fellow Korean. One day, an older black man walked into the store, and the owner, speaking in Korean, told my dad to keep an eye on him because he might steal something. The man finished his shopping, brought his items to the counter, and then, with a big smile, looked at the owner and asked in flawless Korean, "How much?" Most people don't know that I'm fluent in Spanish. While on vacation in Mexico with my husband, we went to a restaurant for dinner. The menu they handed us had the English side facing up, but when I flipped it over, I saw the same menu printed in Spanish, with prices that were about half of what was listed on the English side. Obviously, I ordered food in Spanish. This is very funny. A friend of mine once joked with a waitress in Chinese asking if he could get the secret Chinese menu. To his surprise, she actually brought it out. Honestly, it makes sense in this context. My brother's wife is Chinese, like an actual Chinese citizen. The Western version of Chinese food is definitely not what they eat. A couple of Japanese cashiers were discussing whether my wife's red hair was natural. As we walked out, I casually mentioned to them that it was dyed, but asked them to keep it a secret from my wife that I knew. I was waiting at a crosswalk in a small Japanese town when I overheard a girl telling her friend that this foreigner had amazing eyelashes and that she wished she could borrow them. I turned to her, thanked her for the compliment in Japanese, and watched as her face turned bright red. This reminds me of a trip to Jamaica with my sister. We were sitting at a bar with another Canadian couple we'd just met that day. The husband was white, and the wife had dark skin, striking blue eyes, and thick black hair. The four of us were chatting when the two bartenders started having a conversation in Jamaican Creole. Out of nowhere, the wife turned to her husband and loudly said something in Creole. He responded in the same language, and the bartenders froze for a moment before bursting out laughing and apologizing. It turns out the wife's parents were Jamaican, so she grew up fluent in Creole and had even taught her husband to speak it. The bartenders had been debating whether she was black and speculating why she'd be traveling with a white guy. What she said to her husband was something like, "Can you believe these two idiots talking about us as if we can't understand them?" I was traveling through Sweden after a trip to Russia and stopped by a bar. I could only afford one drink. The locals were incredibly friendly and treated me to a few rounds. Since it had been a while since I'd had a proper drink, I ended up getting completely smashed. On my way back to the campsite, I passed out cold. A couple of guys came over to wake me up and asked if I was okay. Still dazed, I asked if they could point me toward home. That's when I realized they were speaking English, so I asked how they'd figured out I was English. One of them replied, "It's the middle of the day and you are unconscious, face down on somebody's front garden." It was one of those rare moments where I felt both proud and utterly embarrassed at the same time. My wife, a Norwegian, speaks 6 to 7 languages at varying levels and has quite a few entertaining stories. One of the best comes from her time studying in Prague. One evening, she went out with some Czech girlfriends and they ended up at a bar, sitting next to a group of Norwegian guys who were there for a weekend party trip. The guys were fairly drunk and quickly started flirting with my wife and her friends, speaking in that distinct, heavily accented English Norwegians often use. While trying to charm them, the guys began discussing, loudly but in Norwegian, the physical attributes of each girl at the table, how promiscuous they seemed, what they imagined they'd be like in bed, and making explicit comments about what they planned to do later. My wife casually translated every word into Czech for her friends, turning the situation into a game for the girls. As the Norwegians kept buying drinks and getting bolder, they became convinced they'd hit the jackpot. But when the girls suddenly decided to call it a night, the guys were left baffled by the abrupt change in mood. Before leaving, my wife turned to them and in perfect Norwegian said, "It was nice meeting you. Good luck." She then watched as their faces went crimson before she and her friends walked out laughing. My family is Greek, but I have an aunt who lives in Germany. During one of her visits to Greece, she and her husband went to a jewelry store and spoke to the staff in English. While they were browsing rings, my aunt took out a tissue and wiped her nose. One of the salesgirls, assuming my aunt was trying to steal a ring, whispered to her coworker, "I think she hid a ring in that tissue. Keep an eye on her." Without missing a beat, my aunt turned to her and said in Greek, "I blew my nose. Would you want me to show you my boogers?" My boyfriend and I visited Japan, and as a pair of very tall white people, we definitely stood out. Honestly, most locals don't expect foreigners to speak Japanese here at all. While we were waiting at a crosswalk, a little boy holding his mom's hand stared up at my 6-foot-plus boyfriend and exclaimed to her, "Wow, foreigners are really amazing, aren't they?" We couldn't stop laughing about it later, and that was just one of many encounters like this. I'll admit, scaring the life out of some people with my Japanese skills is one of the best parts. It's always hilarious. When my mom was in Japan, she had countless little Japanese girls coming up to touch her hair. They'd never seen blonde hair in person before and were absolutely mesmerized by it. She still loves to share this story. I'm Norwegian but was on vacation in London. While waiting for a lift in the subway with my girlfriend, I overheard 2 girls behind us speaking in Swedish, which I understood. They were talking about how attractive I was, how they'd be totally down to sleep with me if I asked, and how my girlfriend wasn't in my league. They also mentioned I probably didn't realize how good looking I was. When the lift arrived, I turned to them and in Norwegian thanked them for the compliments. Then I added that my girlfriend was way more attractive than both of them. They decided not to join us in the lift. I'm as stereotypically American as it gets, white from the Midwest, and definitely don't look like I'd know any language other than English. But in reality, I've studied a variety of languages, including Chinese, Mandarin, Korean, Japanese, French, Spanish, German, and Italian. Still, I don't look like I'd have a clue about any of them. My favorite strategy is to keep a completely blank expression when people are speaking near me, like I don't have the faintest idea what's being said. One time I was in Seoul, just sitting outside enjoying a quick break before heading back to work. A group of Korean men was standing nearby, smoking and chatting. Naturally, I started eavesdropping. They were throwing around all sorts of insults about me, the fat, clueless American sitting there. They made fun of my looks, intelligence, and everything in between. I didn't let on that I understood a word of what they were saying. I just sat there minding my own business, and if any of them looked at me, I just smiled at them. When my break was over, I got up to head back inside. As I passed by them, I casually said in Korean, "Not all Americans are as dumb as you think." The shocked looks on their faces when they realized I'd understood every word were absolutely, and it's still one of my favorite memories. This happened about 3 years ago when I was on a flight to Asheville. For context, I speak Arabic. As I was sitting there, I overheard a hilarious exchange between 2 men. Man 1, "Where's the woman with the snacks?" Man 2, "She's in the back. What are you planning to get?" Man 1, "I'm craving that crunchy cheese snack." Man 2, "What? Cheese isn't crunchy. Cheese is soft and tasty. Like your mother." I lost my shit laughing, and when they realized I could understand them, they were amazed and we had an enjoyable flight convo.